So, by way of introduction, my name is Dave Moskowitz, and let me start by saying I'm neither a physician, nor a psychologist, nor a psychiatrist, nor even a scientist. And what happened to me is that as a result of having two very good friends, I became involved in a great adventure that they invited me to participate in. One of my friends is a fellow named Harper Arson, and he's from Iceland. He's now about 55, and I first met him in 1992, and it was a result of his son Ivar being best friends with our son Jeffrey, and they were together all the time, and then obviously the parents met. Harper was born, as I said, in Iceland. Have any of you ever been to Iceland? Iceland's a fascinating country, well worth visiting. The present population is about 350,000 people, which makes it smaller in terms of population than Chester County. And Harper was born in a town in the north of Iceland, which was then, and still is, I think, the second largest city in Iceland, and it had 20,000 people. So it's just a little bit bigger than Phoenixville. So he grew up on a farm. In those days, almost everyone was either a farmer or a fisherman. And he wanted to be a veterinarian, and there are no veterinary schools in Iceland. So he applied to go to schools in Norway or Canada, and that didn't work out because of timing, and they didn't have openings at that time. And then he heard that there was a school in Germany in which if you had an MD license, you were a doctor, you could get a veterinarian license in 2 years. So he decided to go to medical school in Iceland. They did have a medical school. However, the medical school was in Reykjavik, which is the capital of Iceland, and is about 8 hours drive from the town he lived in. So during the first year in medical school, he never went to a class. Studied on his own, and he did well, and then he finished the remaining years, and then he did a residency in Iceland, and he came to the United States in 1992 when we met, and he was in the States from 92 to 98. I'm speaking about the geneticist involved in this adventure I'm talking about. And he then went back to Iceland because they then had 3 children. They wanted them to grow up knowing Icelandic customs and being able to speak Icelandic. And so he was in Iceland then from 98 to 2006. And while he was in Iceland, he became a geneticist. And the reason why genetics is so important in Iceland is, first of all, there are only, as I've said, 350,000 people. And secondly, there's been almost no immigration into Iceland. So third, they have church records that go back to the 10th century when the Vikings arrived. And so everyone in Iceland is related to everyone else, depending on how many generations back you go, back to the original half a dozen or 24 Vikings who came to Iceland with the young ladies that they kidnapped in Ireland on the way over. And that's how so the population, you can trace your ancestry back to the 10th century. And then they also have very good medical records in Iceland, and the medical records are available to any doctor in the country. And so you can trace not only the ancestry, but the medical history in various families. And they're very interested in genetics because they're interested in this kind of history. So he started doing genetics work in Iceland. And then in 2006, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, CHOP, decided that it wanted to set up a genetics clinic, and they knew Halkin because he had done work there previously at CHOP. And so they hired him to come back to the States and to form what's called the Center for Applied Genomics at CHOP. Now, you've probably all heard of CHOP, and certainly if you've had children who are sick, you know about it, but CHOP is the first pediatric hospital in the United States, and it's one of the one or two best pediatric hospitals, not only in the United States, but in the world. And CHOP today treats something like 10% of the children in the United States who have rare diseases. So CHOP is an amazing institution. It's a real gem that we have it in this area. And it now has, I think, over 2,000 employees. It has 50 different facilities, including one that recently opened up in King of Prussia. So they decided they would start the Center for Applied Genomics, and they hired Halkin to run it, and it's now 10, 11 years old. They have 70 scientists there, and it has the largest pediatric biobank of samples, of genetic samples in the world. And having a large number of samples becomes very important for this research, for genetics research, because what you're looking for is differences in people and differences that then result in diseases that have genetic causes. And so if you have lots of samples, as they have, it makes it easier to try and find what you're looking for. Also, CHOP has excellent medical records. They instituted a system 10 years ago for having very good medical records. And they have an enormous patient base. So if you're looking for a rare disease and you have to find enough patients who have that rare disease because of their large base of patients, the number of patients they see a year, it's easier to do that at CHOP. And when Halkin started, they set up a system for taking samples, blood or swabs, and then running complete genetic testing on these samples and taking them also for the siblings of the patient and for the parents, and they built up this enormous database of samples. And pediatric samples are better than adult samples for this research because 2-month-old babies do not smoke. And so adult samples are more difficult sometimes to read because of environmental factors that interfere with the samples that you want to study. So at this point, they have the largest data bank, if you will, of samples. They have more information about pediatric illnesses than any place else in the world. And Halkin has 70 scientists working for him there, and they're making discoveries at the rate of 1 a month of either what causes diseases or what the genetics are or what genes are involved in various situations. So it's an incredible institution. And I spent a day there once, and I interviewed 10 people there, and I asked them all the same question. And the question was, is the Center for Applied Genomics unique? And if it is unique, what makes it unique? And all 10 said it is unique, And the reasons are the reasons I've already given you: the size of the data they have, the way the data is organized, that it can be retrieved, the patients and the siblings and the parents who gave the samples. When they gave them, they signed a consent form where they were asked as an option, will you give us the right to contact you if we want to do further research? And 85% checked the block that they were available to be contacted. So therefore, if someone came in with a rare disease, and you should understand that the scientists are discovering 200 to 250 rare diseases a year that we don't know about before this discovery. And a rare disease is defined as a disease in the United States that has less than 200,000 people who have been diagnosed with the disease in the United States. There are some diseases that are so rare. There's one that there's only 35 people known in the entire world who have this disease. But some diseases, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, has 10,000 to 15,000 patients in the United States. So how can, in 2009, 2010, was studying ADHD, and he found what he believed was the cause for a subset of the ADHD patients. In other words, ADHD has several different causes, but approximately 25% of the ADHD patients he traced to a genetic cause which is called mGlu-R, metatropic glutamate receptor genes. And so 25%, 1 in 4 of the ADHD patients have this genetic mutation, this variation from what other people have in terms of their genetics, that has a causative relationship with the ADHD that they have. ADHD is now estimated in the United States to be 1 in 10. That means there are approximately 6.4 million ADHD patients in the United States. So you can figure out what 25% of those are, and if they have the mutation, he believes this is the cause. So he formed a company in 2012 to pursue this research in order to come up with a drug that could compensate for the genetic problem or regulate the problem or modulate it. Not a drug that would cure it, that would change the genetics, but a drug that would allow the genetics to operate the way they're supposed to. And when I say genetics operate, you should understand that the problem is never caused by the genetics. I mean, the genetics is just an encyclopedia or blueprint, people say, a code as to what the history is and how the genes will pass that information on in terms of the development of the cells. The problem almost always, if there's a genetic difference, is in what the genetics produce, the proteins that come from that code. So the problem is almost always a problem in proteins. And so these kids who have this mGlu-R deficiency are not getting the proper protein that would allow them to be able to control their impulses, that would make them lose focus, not be able to concentrate, be reactive to things that happen, hyperactive. and it can be traced back to the proteins they lack, and they lack the proteins because the code for making the proteins doesn't have the right combination of chemicals to allow the right amino acids to be created, which then become the proteins. And it's a problem in signaling. They're called receptors. It's not sending off the signals to create glutamate, which then becomes the proteins. And what's confusing, I thought, when I first started looking at this, is that the receptors are also very often the transmitters. And think of it this way. You walk in the house and you smell bread baking. Well, what's going on? I mean, well, you know that you're smelling with your nose, but does your nose know what the smell of bread is? Well, what happens is you have receptors in your nose. In fact, we all have something like 5 million receptors. And these receptors get the molecules that the bread, while it's baking, sends into the air, and the receptor then gets the molecule. The receptor doesn't recognize it, but it gets to a receptor that will then transmit a signal to the brain. And your memory of what bread smells like is in your memory in your brain, and so that message from that receptor goes to your brain. And if you don't have the receptor working properly, then that message never goes to the brain, and as far as you know, there's no smell of bread in the house because you're not receiving that message. By the way, if anybody has a question, you can stop me at any time and ask the question. I don't mind that at all. And to find these genetic causes is very complicated and very difficult. Why? Well, first of all, as I've said, it's 25% of the ADHD patients, so there are another 75% who don't have this genetic cause, who have some other cause. So you're looking for a subset. And for maybe 20, 30 years, people were looking for the gene that causes ADHD. But it's not a single gene that causes it. There are some diseases that are caused by a single gene that has a problem, but not ADHD. It's caused by several different genes. And in fact, it's something like 279 genes that they were studying, and they ended up with 79 potential genes that could be causing this, and now they've identified 9 of them of the 79. So it's very hard to find which are the genes, and they don't come marked in any way that you know what genes do. I mean, since 2003, there's now a list of all the genes that there are in the Human Genome Project. And it's something like 20,000 to 25,000 different genes. And that the catalog, see, you know what genes there are in the body, but you don't know where they're located necessarily, and you don't know what they do, what their code does, what proteins they create, and what proteins even cause the problem, the physical problem that's manifested, which is called the phenotype. You know, why this problem comes from these genes. If you talk to Halkin, he'll explain it. Well, what I did was this, then this, then this, then this, and it sounds so logical, but it's misleading. It is very, very difficult to do what he was able to do and what he continues to do. And in fact, there are many instances even where genes have been found, like the gene that causes sickle cell anemia, a blood problem. That gene was found in 1956, and to this day, they don't have a medicine that works well to cure the problem. They know what the problem is. The problem is a single gene, and that gene, instead of having the protein that makes normal round red blood cells, makes red blood cells that are sickle shaped like that instead of round. And so they keep hitting each other and they get connected and they form blood clots, and those blood clots will do you in. It's a very serious disease. So they know the gene and they know what it does, but they don't know how to change what the gene's doing. Yes?
So if you, how do you test if someone has that gene mutation? Can they see that particular gene mutation in the blood test?
Yes, they can see it in a blood test. They can find the DNA even from hair.
Is that how they generally do it, though, through blood?
They do it from blood or from a swab from your throat.
And the medication that he created, does it only help people that have ADHD that's caused by that gene mutation?
Great question. I'll get to that. But what you should understand, I guess I should have said this, is that these genes, your DNA, is fixed pretty much for your life. And it's somewhat unique unless you have an identical twin, and that's why DNA is used to find criminals who commit crimes. And your DNA is really so small. I mean, if we shut the lights out and then someone had a flashlight and you'd see little specks of dust in the air, well, that little speck of dust is about as big as a cell, and your body has trillions of cells. I mean, think of it this way, that speck of dust is as big as the egg and the sperm meeting. And in that egg and sperm is the DNA code that 9 months after that will result in a baby being born. So that code creates from that one egg arms, legs, liver, heart, brains, and so forth. And that one little egg, I mean, knows to create a human rather than a chicken. Because that also comes from a little egg, and the chicken's genetics are sometimes, to a certain extent, very similar to ours. In fact, chimpanzees, it's something like 97% the exact same genetics that a human being has. So genetics is everywhere in every living thing. Every plant has genetics, every animal, and that little speck of dust knows it's going to be a chicken or a monkey or a human being. It has all that information in there, and the way it happens is by cells replicating, creating more cells and more cells. I mean, you have cells on the top of your head if you have hair, and that grows, and that cells growing. Fingernails, you know, that's just cells creating new cells. Your skin changes the cells on probably a 6-week turnaround, and it generates new cells. So that's the process that's going on all the time. And when the process goes really awry, we call that cancer. And it just keeps creating more and more cells, and they're cancerous cells, and they reproduce too many cells. Okay, so Halkin makes this discovery, and he decides in 2012 or so, well, once he discovers the cause, then he looks for a drug that will reverse or regulate the problem. And he looks in the medical literature to see if anybody's ever had a drug that they tested, a compound that would seem to affect hyperactivity, and he finds 4 potential compounds. And of the 4, he picks the one that he thinks is the most likely, and it's called faciracetam. And it's a compound that was discovered in Japan, by a company called Nippon, with a second name I can't pronounce. And that company found this compound and used this compound to test patients who had dementia. And they thought that this compound would regulate the production of glutamate, which is the most prevalent amino acid in your brain. And if it could regulate the glutamate, it potentially could reverse or control dementia. And they studied this and ran tests for something like 10 years, and they invested something like $900 million in this drug. And when they got to their final clinical trial, it only helped 9% of the people with dementia. And they couldn't tell you which were the 9%. This was done in the 90s, so they didn't know the genetics. And so they abandoned the project. And you'd say, well, why would they abandon the project, spend all that money? What you should understand is that 94% of the drugs that are tested are not approved. They're either not approved because they have bad side effects, or they're not approved because they don't accomplish what you're using them to try to accomplish.
Question.
Yes.
Is this drug you're talking about an amphetamine derivative?
I'm sorry?
Is the drug that you're talking about an amphetamine derivative?
No, it's a synthetic. And one of the, okay, well, I'll get to that, I guess. So he finds this drug, and this company, Nippon, is a very big company. It's still in existence, and he contacts them, and he wants to get the results of their tests, and he wants to be able to test the compound. He wants to know what the chemical formula is. And Nippon agrees to sell this information to him for $1 million. As I said, they've invested hundreds and hundreds of millions. The average drug that does hit the marketplace takes 12 years to develop. This is on the average, and costs $280 million in testing and other expenses to get to the point where the FDA approves it to be used. And the failure rate is, as I said, 94%. So this is a very difficult thing to do, and my description makes it sound a lot easier than it is. But the failure rate's enormous, the cost is high, and the time involved is high. So, in 2012, he forms a company called Neurofix, and now he enters into an arrangement with CHOP where he works, that CHOP has a 20% interest in anything that comes out of this, and this company, Neurofix, he's now going to try to use Neurofix to get the drug approved by the FDA, to run the clinical trials that you have to run in order to get FDA approval. And he spends about 18 months, Halkin, looking for financing to do this. And it's very difficult to get this financing because, as I said, it's high risk. It's like a lottery ticket, and it's very expensive. And he can't get the financing. Now comes the second character in my cast of characters. So the second character is my next door neighbor. His name is Phil Harper, and I've known Phil since he moved in and we moved in the same time, which is 1991, so I've known him as long as I've known Halkin. And Ivar, Halkin's son, knew Phil because the two boys, who were 7, 8, 9, would always play, and he lives right next door, and they would end up playing on his tennis court, or he'd be out there and he would talk to them. And he's a very interesting person to talk to. He's had a fascinating career. He was born in Detroit. He's about 67 now. Born in Detroit, and he went into the Army when he was 17. and he spent 20 plus years in the Army, rose high in the ranks, did all kinds of fascinating things in the Army, most of which I'm not permitted to talk about. A lot of what he did is classified. And he would tell the boys these stories about what he had done, and he had all kinds of souvenirs so he could show them, this is the bayonet that I got stabbed in the arm with, here's the scar, and you know, he's got a gun collection, and he's got all these flags and all this stuff. And these boys, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, they were just fascinated with Mr. Harper. And of course, Ivar would go home and tell his parents about this Mr. Harper fellow who lived next door to Jeff. So these two men knew of each other but never met when Halkin lived in this area from 92 to 98. They did meet in 2006 at our house when we had them both over for a barbecue. And the three couples became very good friends. And so when we would have these barbecues or go out to dinner or go to the opera or whatever we went to, we would always be asking Halkin, how's the project coming, getting Neurofix done? And he would explain where he was. I guess I left out that in 2012, when he formed the company, he came to me and asked me if I would help him in the project. And I, of course, being a friend, said, of course I will. And I'm by trade a lawyer, and I've been involved in many, many different businesses, so I'm like a serial entrepreneur. So I was the second member of the board of directors and the second corporate officer. And so I was helping, but I also couldn't get him the financing. But in 2013, after one of these barbecues, Phil Harper, my next door neighbor, decided that he would invest $2,250,000 in this company, Neurofix, so that Neurofix could run a clinical trial to see if it could prove that this medicine, this drug compound, facilitacidum, that the Nippon company would give the information for the $1 million, whether that would actually have a favorable effect on ADHD patients. So in the early spring of 2015, we ran a clinical trial. And the clinical trial was at Jefferson Hospital in Philadelphia, and we had 30 patients from CHOP who had been diagnosed as ADHD positive. They'd been diagnosed as having ADHD.
Can I ask you?
Sure,
Is
ask
that
anything.
diagnosis through like data collection, or is it, say they've been diagnosed ADHD?
Well,
What
CHOP
did they use at that time?
CHOP's a treating hospital.
Right, so how
So
have they diagnosed?
it made the physicians at CHOP had made the diagnosis. There are criteria for the diagnosis that have been agreed upon by the society that does this. I think we're in the 5th version of that diagnosis. Do you know what version?
The DSM-5?
Yeah, it's number 5, and it's not so easy to diagnose an ADHD patient, but there are criteria, and these patients were all diagnosed by the treating physicians as having ADHD. And they were in a sense re-diagnosed when they signed up for the trial, because in order to participate in the trial, they wanted to reconfirm that these patients actually had the disease being ADHD. And these patients had all been genetically tested. So these are cherry-picked patients because they all had the mGlu mutation. So it wasn't like just 30 people who had 30 patients. They were all adolescents between 7 and 18, all had ADHD, and all had the mGlu mutation that Halkin said causes ADHD in patients who have the mutation. and have the disease. Now, some people could have the mutation and not have the disease. And sometimes these mutations cause not one disease, but a variety of diseases. And that's proven to be true in this case. And the reason I say it's proven to be true, that of the 30 patients, 7 of them also had autism. And 2 of them had a disease called 22q. Now, has anyone heard of this disease? Okay, so it's called 22q 11.2 deletion syndrome. And what that means is that in these patients, well, autism 10 years ago was thought to be 1 in 150. It's now 1 in 68. ADHD is 1 in 10 now. And 22q is about 1 in 1,000 births. It's almost as common as Down syndrome, which is 1 in 800 to 850, something like that. But it's virtually unknown. And what it is in the 22nd chromosome, in the Q stem, every chromosome has a Q stem and a P stem. And one's long, one's short. In the Q stem, in the region that they call 11.2, the gene that should be there, that is there for most people, is missing. And so this disease became called 22q, 11.2 deletion syndrome. And there's a variation of it where the gene is there, but there are too many of them. So it's 22q 11.2 duplication syndrome. There are 3 rather than 2. So this disease, by the way, has very much a Philadelphia history. Back in the 1970s, there was a doctor at St. Christopher's Hospital in Philadelphia named Angelo DeGeorge. And he was a specialist in congenital brain problems that newborns had. And he would operate on them in the first few hours or days of their birth. And that was his specialty. I'm sorry, did I say brain? Heart problems. I'm sorry. They had congenital heart problems. And he would perform an operation on their heart to correct what that congenital heart problem was. And in the 1970s, he noticed that almost all of these patients he had operated on when they were newborns ended up having ADHD. And so he started writing an article saying, you know, there must be some relationship between these kids who were born with these heart problems and ADHD. That he just noticed that. Meanwhile, there were doctors in Japan who reached the same conclusion as the kids who had cleft palate problems, that many of them had ADHD. And there was a doctor in Montana who noticed another obscure disease, and those kids had ADHD. So at CHOP, they found this genetic cause, this missing gene in the 22nd chromosome. And that's where it was discovered. And they invented there a test for proving that that was the cause of this 22q disease. And today, CHOP has more 22q patients than any place in the world. And if you have a child who has 22q, that's where they end up.
What are the symptoms or signs?
The symptoms are a whole wide range of physical symptoms. Either they have heart problems, they have developmental problems, they're smaller in stature, they have speech problems, they have mobility problems, and so they have a whole range of physical problems. And then they have ADHD, or they have autism, or they have some disability, some mental disability that's associated with the same cause.
And they weren't prematurely born or anything else?
No,
like
no,
that?
they're not prematurely born. So, in the 30 ADHD patients who were being tested in the first 3 months of 2015, 7 of them also had autism, and 2 of them had 22q, because they came out of CHOP. That's where the 22q patients are. One of them had the deletion, and one of them had the duplication. And so they set up a clinical trial. To do a clinical trial on humans, you need permission of the FDA, and you have to file a protocol for approval. So in this book that is the subject of what I'm talking about, there are some pictures in the middle. Here. So there's a picture of CHOP. Here's a picture of Hauken Arson. And this is the picture of the protocol that was filed with the FDA. It's about that high. And so all this information, much of it came from Nippon, the Japanese company. All this information's given to the FDA, and they give the permission to run the clinical trial. And so the clinical trials run in the first 3 months of 2015. And it's a regimen that's followed for all 30. They come in the first weekend and they're interviewed to confirm that they actually do have ADHD, to make sure they don't have other problems that might skew the results. There has to be a clean out phase where they stop using whatever medication they're on, and most ADHD patients are on one or a multiple set of medications, because what happens with the present medications, which are mostly stimulants, is the doctors don't know which one works with which child, so it's a kind of fail-safe procedure. We'll try this one, see how that works, and they all have side effects. And so the average compliance period of someone being on a medicine for ADHD is 4 months. And most of them then come off it, or they try something else, and in some cases they find something that works and doesn't have side effects that are terrible, and so they stay on that. But in order to participate in this test, in order to be certain that we would know whether the medicine was having an effect, they had to come off any other medication. They had to have a washout period, usually 2 weeks, and they had to agree to come back every weekend for at least 6 weekends. And what would happen on the second, they would come in the first weekend to be examined, thorough physical examination, and confirm the diagnosis. And then they have 6 weeks they have to come back. And the first week they would be given a small dose of the medicine in a pill on the Saturday morning, and then they would be tested virtually every hour for 12 hours. They'd have a blood test to make sure there were no bad side effects from taking the pill. So catch it early if there was going to be a problem, and take the patient off that. That's the kind of thing you have to do in clinical trials, especially clinical trials on children. Now, Hauken knew from the Japanese testing that there were no side effects, none at all, for this drug. So it wasn't a surprise that everybody who came and took it didn't have any side effects, because that had been pretty well established by the Japanese. So they would, on this, so they come in, they'd get a small dose, 50 milligrams, and they'd stay in the hospital for 12 hours. And then they'd come back on the Sunday, and they'd be tested once again, And then they'd be given a box of pills for the first week, 2 a day you would take. And what they weren't told, these patients, is the first week was going to be placebos. Placebos are like fake medicine that don't have any sugar pill. They don't have any effect. And then after the first week, they'd come back each weekend, and some of them were from out of town, so it was some chore to come back. For 6 weekends, and then they would get 100 milligrams, 200 milligrams, up to 400 milligrams in this regimen, and they would be examined every weekend when they came back, and blood tests, and urine tests, and so forth, so you could gauge how this was working. It doesn't have side effects. And they were also given tests to test their ability to concentrate. The test they used was CGI, which stands for Global, CG is Global, Clinical Global Information Improvement. I think that's what it is. And also a test called the Vanderbilt test, and a series of 8 or 9 other tests, and the parents would be asked what the response was and so forth. Now, so what's involved in doing this is 3 couples. Halkin and his wife, Phil and his wife, and me and my wife. And we would meet during this clinical trial for 3 months every Sunday night and have dinner together, and Halkin would come over. Halkin would be there, of course, and he would report on what's happening with our 30 kids. And we called this the neighborhood drug company. And the 6 would meet, and Halkin would report on what was happening. And I'll tell you just one anecdote. One of the early patients in the first cohort of 6, they would come 6, each for 6 weeks. One of the patients was like, the parents were right out of central casting for this purpose. The father was a cardiologist, and the mother was an ICU nurse. So these people were medically very astute, of course. And the kid was given the 50 milligram on the first day, and Halkin examined him and almost knocked him out of the test when he examined him, because he responded so quickly to the medicine. He no longer was exhibiting hyperactivity or attention deficits. And Halkin thought, well, maybe he's been misdiagnosed. But the parents said, no, we don't know why he's like this. And then on the Sunday, when the medicine had worn off, he was off the wall again. And Halkin knew that this kid's qualified. Then he was given the box with the placebo pills, and the parents called Halkin 3 times that week saying, we don't see anything happening. There's something wrong with Halkin. He wouldn't tell them it was a placebo because that wasn't part of the system. He said, well, it takes a little time. Keep taking it. And so they stayed in the test. They came back the next weekend. They got the real pill the next weekend. And Halkin on the Thursday gets a call from the parents, and they're off the wall because they said the teacher had called and we have to appear at school tomorrow because we don't know why. And then they came in on the Saturday and they said the teacher had called because the teacher wanted to know what had changed in this kid. Said the kid for the first time was brought his homework in, done on time. He cooperated in class. He was starting to make friends. And so the change was like almost instantaneous. And the stories of other kids' reaction was almost the same. I mean, there was a positive reaction in every one of the 30. Now, some to a higher degree than others, but there was a positive reaction and noticeable positive reaction. So after the test was over, people had noticed these kids on the elevator change, and they knew something was going on that was improving the lives of these kids. And while the original plan with the company was that we would go through a second clinical trial, usually you would do 3, a phase 1, a phase 2, and a phase 3. And after you finish your phase 3, if that's successful, then the FDA will approve your drug. So the thought we had, the 3 of us who were involved in the company, was that we'd go through the phase 2, and then we would sell the company to a larger company, which would then go through the phase 3 and bring it out on the market. But the results were so astounding that a company in Wayne called and wanted to buy Neurofix. And so Phil and I went over to meet with them, and they made a very nice offer. We turned it down. We turned down 5 more, but the 6th offer was just ridiculous, and so we ended up selling the company. And bear in mind that this company, Neurofix, is a company that only ever had 2 members of the board of directors, of which I was one, 2 corporate officers, of which I was one, never had a single employee, never had an office. It had a registered office, which was a mail drop, but never had an office, never had an employee, never had a phone number, never had a web page, never had an email address. It was a virtual company. And the company was really, there are the 6 of us in the book, the 3 of us and the 3 wives that met every Sunday. There was the neighborhood drug company. And so we sold the company. So we were out one night celebrating, the 6 of us, and someone said, this was such a great adventure that we all participated in, and we're going to improve the lives of millions of people. Someone should write a book about this. And no one volunteered, so I wrote the book. So this is the book. Finding the Genetic Cause and Therapy for ADHD, Autism, and 22q.
Where can we get the book?
And I brought copies in case somebody wanted to buy one. The book starts with a chapter on what's called precision medicine. And you may know that when Obama writes his legacy as to what he's done, very high on the list is going to be what's called the Precision Medicine Initiative. In the 2015 State of the Union address, he announced that he was creating a precision medicine initiative, and the idea was to try and find the genetic code and relate it to diseases and build up a biobank of 1 million samples throughout the United States, and the results of the genetic testing of these 1 million samples would be available to anyone doing research. And the Congress went along with it and put up $215 million, I think it was, to get the Precision Medicine Initiative going. It was criticized by many doctors who said, well, we always pay attention to our individual patients, and we're always prescribing a remedy for them that we think's related to their particular medical history and their lifestyle, and we know our patients, and what is this Precision Medicine Initiative? Why do we need it? Doctors in general are resistant to changes, I guess like most professionals who know a subject matter, and they're resistant to people coming along with, well, don't do it that way, do it a different way. One example of how difficult this is to get doctors to go along with these kinds of changes. There was a doctor in a small town in Australia named Barry Marshall, and he was a GI doctor. And he came to the conclusion that ulcers, which were believed to be caused by stress, were not caused by stress, but were caused by bacteria. And he started treating his patients for problems of bacteria with antibiotics. And he thought doctors treating ulcer patients by reducing stress and other mild remedies were off course. And he couldn't convince anyone of this, and he kept writing articles and publishing. So what he did one day was he went to another GI doctor and got fully tested, and he had no problem of an ulcer. You know, he had colonoscopy and endoscopy, and by an independent doctor. So he had a full record with the results. He had no ulcer. And he took the bacteria from one of his patients and gave it to himself.
Oh, gosh.
And sure enough, 4 months later, he had an ulcer. So he then got treated for his ulcer, and he thought he had proved it. And you know, even though he had done that, it took another 10 years for the medical community to agree that he was right. And he ended up getting the Nobel Prize in Medicine, by the way, for this. But it took 20 years from him originally announcing the discovery to getting to the point where it was generally accepted by other doctors. There's enormous resistance to change. Yes?
Was there anything like that for treatment of ADHD patients that is not on the market, but people have been trying, you know, like marijuana, or is there anything like that that you know of that somebody in a small town in Australia has tried on ADHD, but it's not been accepted yet by the general public?
Well, there are psychologists and psychiatrists who are trying various procedures that aren't, you know, taking drugs. And then there are the stimulants that are being tried. But I don't know of anyone anywhere who's found something effective and can tell you which ones it'll be effective on. Do you know of anyone?
Just meditation.
Well, there's a whole series of medications.
No, meditation, I mean.
Meditation.
Yeah.
Well, there's behavioral
Right, just behavioral
techniques
stuff. But
that
yeah,
are
I'm not aware of
used.
anything
Yeah.
psychopharmacologic other than the stimulants.
You know, there are behavioralists, you know, therapists,
Yeah.
and they have some success.
And have there been any studies, you know, like sickle cell anemia? Is that one that's more prevalent, and is that Jewish or African?
No, that's African
Okay.
Americans. It
So
tends to
is
be
there any
prevalent.
study done that ADHD is more prevalent in certain groups of people? I'm thinking my son's adopted from Guatemala, and whenever we get together with the Guatemalan adoption families, I swear every other kid, if not every kid, has been diagnosed with ADHD.
Yeah, but
So we don't know if it's the adoption or prenatal care, or, you know, that's, I'm wondering, is anyone doing studies like that, or?
there's nothing
more prevalent?
that I know of. I mean, the obvious answer to me of the phenomenon you're suggesting is that these kids are tough kids, and so they get put up for adoption.
No, they're adopted.
They're infants.
They're as infants. It's
Oh,
like
okay,
2 and
well,
4 months old when they're adopted.
Well, in the United States, the general thought is it's 1 in 10 now. The
And
1
that's why I
in
think this
10
group
births.
is much greater than 1 in 10 when we're together, because almost all the families have the same kinds of problems when they sit down. Like, and I brought it up once, and to be honest, I thought they were going to lynch me because I was trying, you know, and
Yeah,
I was
sure.
just trying to be honest. Like,
Sure.
let's talk about this. I'm not saying it is, but it does seem there's a high prevalence of ADHD with these kids that have been adopted. And I'm a teacher, and I know that I'd go in the special ed classroom.
Sure.
Half, if not more than half, were adopted kids, and the kids that were getting special ed services. And it's like, is that prenatal, or is there some prevalence from their genetic background, and then they were adopted as infants too. It wasn't that they were difficult children and placed for adoption. They were. So I don't know if anybody's doing studies. It's probably one of those sensitive topics or issues that.
It's sensitive. It's
I'm always
clearly
hesitant to
in,
even bring it up because, as I said, when I brought it up in that parent group, some people were highly offended. It's like, I want to be honest about these things so you can find out if there is something related to these children that we can try to help them. I'm not trying to label them, I'm trying to help them and figure it out.
I can't answer that question. What I do know, which is somewhat related to what you're answering, is that people who are treating the 22q children have told me that when the parents come in, they can spot it on the parents, and in most cases the parents don't even know they have it, but they have a mild case. And if both parents have it, it'll be a severe case in the child. And they look at the two parents and they say, they can tell from the facial features that this is a 22q patient, but they don't even know they have 22q, the parents. It's the child, and then it's prevalent with all the siblings in that family.
What are the facial features like?
The facial, if I didn't bring the book, there's a book called Faces of Sunshine that CHOP has written, and they have pictures in there of the 22q children. And I went to a conference in Italy 2 summers ago for 22q children. This bag comes with the conference, and you could spot not as obvious as Down syndrome children, but you could tell in their faces various facial features which seemed unusual, and stature, as I said, is noticeably smaller, and they have movement problems, and then you can spot it in pretty young kids that they have this.
The 22q patients who also had autism, when they received the medication, did it help the symptoms of autism as well?
Yes, dramatically.
Wow.
And in fact, it may have more of a dramatic effect on autism than on ADHD. The company that bought our company, Neurofix, has just run a few clinical trials, and the results on autism are very dramatic.
Has the drug gone to market yet?
It's working, yes.
It's already being.
It's well, they've done a
FDA.
phase 2 trial,
Oh, okay.
and they're planning a phase 3 trial
Oh, so it's
for
not
later
available
this
yet.
year or early next year.
Do they?
And hopefully the drug will be on the market 2019, maybe
Oh, that's
2018. It would go faster if it were used for 22q, because that's what they call an orphan disease, a rare disease. And they call it an orphan because these diseases that are rare aren't treated generally, because there aren't enough patients that the drug companies can make enough money to treat them. So the FDA will approve it faster, and 22q has absolutely no medicine available that helps for 22q. They can cure the physical defects like the heart problems or the cleft palate you can be operated on, but the incidence of schizophrenia in 22q patients when they get into their 20s is like 65% of them will have schizophrenia. I mean, so it's a
Is there a
very
high
severe.
prevalence of that with ADHD?
Yes, there's a high incidence with ADHD too, but not as high as with 22q.
I haven't heard anything about this in the news.
Well, as I said, it's virtually unknown, and yet it's getting to be more and more known as it's getting to be more prevalent. And this conference I went to, there must have been 50 different physicians who were talking about their 22q patients. The oddest thing to me, sitting there and not being actively involved in treating the patients at all, was that someone would get up, like from Denmark, and say, I have 22q patients, and I'm doing this and I'm doing that. and I would like to get more information from other people who have patients. I have 6 of them. I have 10 of them. And then Halkin gets up to speak, and he says, well, at CHOP we have 1,300 22Q patients. So there's such a larger patient base that you can test much more effectively and get more information. And that's why a lot of this is coming out of CHOP, because that's what they do.
So not all 22Q patients are autistic, but
That's right, not all are.
Are all autistic patients 22Q?
No. There are, however, this one discovery, this mGlu-R mutation in a subset of patients, 25% of ADHD patients have it, 25% of autism patients, and something like 100% of 22Q patients have this same mutation.
So these people that have this mutation are at risk for schizophrenia?
Yes.
So for the kids with ADHD that are taking stimulants, wouldn't that put them at greater risk for developing psychosis?
I don't know the answer to that.
That's kind of scary to think
And I
about.
don't know if that's ever
Let's
been
hope not.
looked at or tested. But schizophrenia, of course, is very, very serious.
Yeah. Well, amphetamines, I mean, with people that are addicts can cause psychotic symptoms. So you would think that a similar drug, somebody taking it that's predisposed wouldn't be a good idea.
You know,
So your drug actually sounds much better, like a better alternative.
well, there's no question that with the drug that Halkin found, there are no side effects. There's just no question about that at all. The Japanese, they tested thousands, and no one ever had a side effect. So it was pretty clear that there wasn't going to be a bad side effect.
So is
But
it
you
very-
still had to go through the testing to satisfy the FDA.
That's so rare for a drug. Like, is it so precise the way that it performs? Like, it's so targeted?
I not only can't answer that, I don't know if anyone can answer that question. In other words, something like 25% of the drugs that work, they know what the drug is going to do, but they don't know why it does it or how it does it. Something like 25% of them. And in this case, I don't think anyone's published any explanation for why this compound will correct the problem. All they know is it's a signaling problem, and that this then regulates the signals. It may well be that what it does is for the ones that have, for instance, one missing gene, it makes the other gene work harder, and therefore it can produce more, and that's enough, that difference is enough to offset what's missing.
It's really
So
cool.
that gets enough protein, and it works. But I haven't seen anyone yet explain why this drug, how it does what it does. But it was tested on animals, fish, and beagles it was tested on, and they could see the results. In other words, you could have mice running all over the place, and you could give them this, and then now they become very docile, and it slows down their activity. And so it was, they knew what the effect was, and that's why he wanted to test it on ADHD, because they knew it worked in the animal tests. And as I said, the genetics of animals are very similar to the genetics of human beings. So you test them on animals. That's why all the tests are done on animals, because that gives you good information.
What about the 75% of autistic patients who don't have the 22q would
Well, there's 75% of autistic patients who don't have the mGlu-R mutation. And theirs is caused by something else. We don't know what.
so that medication wouldn't help them? then?
That probably would not help them. That's right.
So, well,
Could you spell that M?
It's
The letter M?
it's the letter M lowercase,
Uh-huh.
uppercase G,
Okay.
L, U lowercase, R uppercase.
Does,
And it's metathropic glutamate receptors.
Lowercase m, capital G, lowercase lu, and then capital R.
Right.
Mutation.
And if you go on, by the way, on Google and just type in 22q, all this information about 22q will come up.
does the mutation, the autistic people that have the mutation, is it a certain type of autism on the spectrum? Like, is there?
I don't think they've tested enough to know that.
Is it only youth who have been tested at this time?
The company that bought Neurofix tested as well children who were 3 to 7. And then they ran a test on the 7 to 18 as Neurofix did. So they expanded it that way. And the thought is that if somebody's on this at age 16, they'll have to stay on it for the rest of their life. So eventually it'll be used to treat adults who have it. And of course, sometimes some doctor who's treating ADHD patients may have an adult ADHD. He said, well, this works on the kids, I'll give it to you, see if it works. It's called off-label prescriptions, but you know, that happens all the time.
So if this came out on the market, the medication, should I have an adult son who is autistic. He's actually 50 years old now. If I took him to the doctor to be tested to see if he had this.
First, you want to know his genetics, and if he meets the profile, then if it's on the market, then you're free to use it.
Which is usually covered by insurance now, the genetic testing.
And it's become much less
Miracle,
expensive
isn't it?
to have the genetic testing
Would
done.
would that show up in a normal genetic testing? That-
I don't know what you mean by normal genetic testing. I mean, they're all
My
different
son
kinds.
just had the psychiatrist did a genetic.
Well, he
send
won't
it
do
up.
it. He'll have to
Took
send
the
it to a
swab out of his
lab.
mouth and send it in
He has to
somewhere.
send it to a lab, and then there are various different procedures for testing to get the genetics. There's several different ones. So I don't know what the range of the genetic testing would be.
But isn't it true they would have to ask to try and identify the 22q gene?
Sure. They have to say what the purpose of the genetic testing is, and then they'll test for mGuR and for other things that are then relevant to be tested.
So I do have a question. The difference, you state that the doctors saw the difference in the parents when the kids were on the medicine. Was it because of the change in the children that they saw a big difference, so their lives got easier? There was sort of more of an understanding for the parents themselves?
Well, that I don't know. I don't know if the parents were ever asked that. Because they were testing the children.
Yeah.
But the parents had to respond. There were parent questionnaires that had to be filled out, and they were very long, and the parents had to respond as to what was going on in the child's life. So that was part of the testing procedure. Self-response. And the children were given questionnaires too. You know, how do you feel, what's happening? And do you feel like you're able to focus better? And so forth. These are well-established tests. They're very reliable. And so when in fact, Houken has written an article which has all the test results, which will be published one of these days in a very prestigious magazine called Nature.
Oh, what?
And I said to Houken, when I had finished the book, I said, you know, I think I ought to put in the back of the book a list of articles you've written about ADHD or autism. Could you send me a list? And he sent me over a list of 75 articles he's written. So he's absolutely amazing. And so they're in the book.
Oh, that's awesome.
Shouldn't it?
That's awesome.
Yeah.
They're in the book.
It's awesome
I wanna buy the
that
book.
he is able to find what isn't really visible even with very powerful microscopes. that he can see it. I equate it in the book to, I love sports, and Halkin does too, and whenever we talk it gets into sports. In basketball, point guards can bring up the ball and they can see where their teammates are going before the teammates even decide what they're going to do. They can sense this one's going to break for the basket, this one's tired, this one's in this favorite spot in another millisecond, and they have this court vision that they can see what's about to happen, even sometimes before the player decides he's going to do it, but they can see he's cutting, I'm going to throw it up in the air, it's going to be an alley-oop, and Halkin has that kind of vision for seeing genetic issues and relating them to what are called phenotypes, to relating them to physical manifestations that are evident in people who have that disease. And he can see that connection that isn't there to be seen. It's very hard to explain this, how he does it. I mean, I asked these people who work with him, well, how does he do this? I mean, they said that the Center for Applied Genomics is unique in the world for the reasons I've given, and 8 of the 10 said because Halkin's here and he's unique. He has a gift that he can do this. And people ask me, well, what is this? I mean, and is this the only example I can come up with to try to explain this? We have a dog, Luca, and he's 2 years old. And I'll take him to the daycare sometimes, 8 o'clock in the morning. And one of the grandkids will come over at 9 o'clock, and he'll stay in the house for half an hour, and then he'll leave. And then I'll pick Luca up at 6 o'clock, and I'll bring him home, and he'll take one step into the house, and he smells not only that a grandkid was there, but which kid it was. Because he will run to the room that kid's likely to be in. Now, how is that smell lingering there for 8 hours after that kid's not there? I mean, how does he do that? Well, I know that in theory a human being has 5 million receptors in their nose and a dog has 300 million. So they can smell 60 times better than we can smell. But can you visualize that? I mean, what is it to smell like that? It's so hard to understand how that's done. I mean, that's something special that dogs have. I mean, you've seen them at airports sniff around luggage. I mean, they're smelling what's inside the luggage. I mean, how do they do that? It's just a gift that they have, and he has a similar kind of gift. He's able to see connections that aren't visible, and then you test them out, and sure enough, he's right. Because this discovery is only one of his discoveries. We're now working on 5 more of his discoveries. And we'll see what happens with them.
Has he received any major awards for his work?
He has been named by Thomson Reuters as one of the top 1% of scientists in the world.
He deserves it.
So I don't know if that's, I don't know what a major award is. I believe, and this is my deal with him, that he will get the Nobel Prize in Medicine someday. And he's promised me if that happens, that I'll be there with him. But that's, he's just very special.
Well, I think you and your 6 are very special, too.
Well, it was, I look back on all these years of doing various things, but this is my legacy. This is the best thing I've ever done.